At 11:40 p.m., 22-year-old Gloria Davy came home from a date with her fiancé. He now had 7 captives, isolated in their corner apartment and out of earshot from their closest neighbors. The women sat terrified, trying to joke with Speck as he casually smoked.
They had been trained as nurses through psychology courses to calm people. That was one primary thing that made them think that Speck, we can talk him out of this, we can use our psychology.
But the women fell silent when Speck crushed his cigarette, stood up, and flipped open a switchblade. He sliced a bedsheet into long strips, careful to keep the gun within easy reach. He tied each of his prisoners up, binding their hands behind their backs and knotting their ankles tightly.
I think he went there to rob them, and I think he went there to see what sexual pleasures might result from the robbery without any clear intent of homicide.
This video, made years later while Speck was in prison, is the only time on record that he spoke of that night.
What you locked up for?
They count murder.
Did you kill him?
Sure I did.
Why?
Just one there night.
In minutes, Speck had all 7 young women helpless and immobile on the floor. First, he grabbed 20-year-old Pamela Wilkening, and she showed him her contempt.
One of them spit on me in the face. Said she's gonna kick me out of the lineup.
The insult enraged Speck. He took Wilkening to a bedroom across the hall, gagged her, and pinned her to the floor, intent on raping her. But 2 other nurses, Marianne Jordan and Suzanne Ferris, unaware of what was going on, walked into the room, surprising Speck. At that point, all of his rage exploded. The women tried to run away, but they never made it out of the bedroom.
There's 2 more there, so I off them.
Speck stabbed them over 20 times with his switchblade, then turned his attention to the other young women.
Wound up trying to kill off all the women.
Over the next 4 hours, Speck methodically killed 6 more of his captives, washing their blood from his hands after each murder.
Why you use the gun? Why did you prefer to use a knife?
It doesn't make too much noise. It has no shape to run. The knife's quiet.
Speck's nonchalance in the video belies the brutality that he unleashed that night. Valentina Passion's throat was sliced through to her larynx. Patricia Matuzak suffered a vicious kick to her midsection. He saved Gloria Davy for last.
She was the one that was flirting with him. She was the last one to go. I knew I had all the time in the world. I took her out there to this one, either jaw or costume to get naked, big.
On Gloria, it would seem that Speck unleashed a lifetime of buried rage toward all women, especially his mother and his ex-wife. He dragged her downstairs to the couch, raped and sodomized her, then strangled her to death. After checking the large bedroom for valuables and survivors, Speck strolled out of the front door and into the night. He stopped on the Calumet River Bridge to toss his bloody switchblade into the water. He went to bed that night at the Shipyard Inn, believing he had committed the perfect crime. By daybreak, reports of the slaughter were front-page news.
Our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Windmiller, asked me if I heard this awful screaming. And
may we get the other descriptions, Doctor, where the other bodies were and what happened?
In the east bedroom, there were 2 girls lying on the floor.
The only thing that I might say to this man is that he is psychologically sick, and he ought to turn himself in. He ought.
As I said before, this is the crime of the century, because innocent...
There were far more questions than answers.
Who would do this? 8 young women who were doing good in the world. All they wanted to do was heal people as nurses. So the questions were, how could they all be killed at once? How did he do it? And then who was he, and was he still in the city?
That morning, Richard Speck was just a mile from the crime scene, confidently drinking in the same seedy bars he had been in the night before. But Speck had made a mistake. He'd left a survivor. Throughout the massacre, Corazon Amarau had been huddled under a bed just a few feet away, praying furiously.
When he heard that there was a survivor, that's when he immediately changed his name, called a cab, went to Cabrini Green to leave a dead-end trail, and did everything to escape his identity and escape Chicago.
Speck wound up a mile and a half west of Chicago's business district, among the bums of Skid Row. He checked into a 90-cent-a-day room under the name R. Franklin. Speck didn't stray far from his hotel, knowing the police would have all public transportation from the city well guarded. By Saturday, July 16th, evidence against Speck was overwhelming. 33 fingerprints were lifted from the crime scene. Based on Corazon Amarau's positive identification, the prints were matched to Speck through Dallas police. Chicago Police Chief O.W. Wilson publicly named Richard Speck responsible for the murders of the 8 student nurses. The uproar surrounding the case made Speck's capture seem inevitable, but Richard Speck had no intention of ever facing his accusers. In July 1966, Richard Speck was the most wanted man in America for murdering 8 young nurses on Chicago's South Side. He hid away in a Skid Row hotel, but realized that escaping the city was impossible. 3 days after the murders, on July 16th, Speck polished off a quart of cheap wine, smashed the bottle, and used the jagged glass to rip gashes through the veins in both his arms. Richard lay down beneath a ceiling of chicken wire in his hotel room, slowly bleeding to death, trapped by the publicity that he had always vowed he'd get. But even slashing a wrist and arm would not prove to be a way out. The hotel handyman discovered Speck and called police. When the cops arrived, they didn't recognize Speck. They rushed him to Cook County Hospital, where his identity was discovered, just beneath the dried blood caked over his arms.
And I wiped the blood away, and there was "Born to Raise Hell." And I looked at the nurses and I said, "This is the fellow that the police are looking for."
Within hours, hundreds of reporters were descending on the hospital for a glimpse of the notorious killer. Speck's court-appointed lawyer, Gerald Getty, and prosecutor Bill Martin received access.
I guess you expected to see horns growing out of his head, but to me, he did not look capable of being a person who could murder 8 people.
Behind Speck's dull eyes was a savagery that only his victims knew. Their last funeral services were held on July 18th, a day honoring the patron saint of nurses, Camillus.
It was in everybody's life because everybody knew a nurse and everybody had a daughter or a child that this could have happened to who was at college. That, you know, just that the freakishness of an intruder coming in, invading, was what was so awful about it. Everybody wanted him to fry.
When questioned, Speck's memory of the murders was conveniently lacking. All he could recall, he said, was drinking at the Shipyard Inn from 6 o'clock until 8, when he claimed to have been given an injection of speed by a stranger.
And he said after that, he didn't remember anything. He never denied it. He said, if I'm accused of it, I don't remember it. And that's the most I ever got out of him.
His story seemed tailor-made for an insanity defense. As resident psychiatrist of the Cook County Jail, Dr. Marvin Zaporin met with Speck in his cell twice a week. He forged what he believed to be a bond of trust between them.
I was operating under the concept of innocent until proven guilty. So I said, this is an allegation against you. Who knows? You say you don't remember it. Maybe it wasn't you, just hypothetically. At which point he would say, of course it was me. Because if he was looking for a way out, he would have leaped at that. But he never tried to do that.